right. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our newest Women at the Well virtual book club series. We're here with Springs in the Desert. I'm Allie, and I'm here with Ann and Stacey. And we're so excited. We know that there are a lot of y'all who had read this book even before we announced the book club series. And there's just a really nice following for this book. But we are going to be reading Under the Laurel Tree, Grieving Infertility with Saints Joachim and Anna. And we're just really excited because this is a book that is actually about infertility, and it has a lot of good material in it. So we're looking forward to a great discussion, both amongst the three of us, and then hearing your comments and questions. Stay tuned on the Facebook group. We're going to be hopefully offering a chance to discuss via Zoom some of the content of this book. So look for that on our Facebook group, and hopefully you can be a part of it. So before we get into the discussion, Anne is going to give us a little background on Saints Anne and Joachim and a little bit more about the book. Turn it over to you, Anne.
Yeah, so I love this book. And I just want to say before we get started, so for every book club that we have done, we always say that it's not necessary to have the book and read the book in order to listen to the podcast and participate in discussion. So truth be told, that Elizabeth Lasser book is so wonderful, but I am not anywhere, like I haven't made much headway in it. But the book club and your discussion really inspired me to read it, but just, I don't know, I just took so much away from it. So even if you don't have this book, if you're not reading this book currently, you know, I think you can still benefit from this discussion. But I really encourage everybody listening to get this book, Under the Laurel Tree by Nicole Roccas, because it is so good. And it just has been speaking to me on so many different levels. I find it consoling. I find it challenging. And just so inspiring. And I don't know, as I've been reading it, I don't know how you both feel about it, but I almost feel like I'm sitting with a friend and, you know, just kind of sharing our feelings. So I think because it comes from a woman who is in the midst of this experience of infertility, it just is so impactful. And this was the first book that we're doing that directly pertains to infertility. So I just wanted to put that out. I really encourage people to get this book because it's great. And as you said, Allie, this is inspired by the story of Saints Anna and Joachim, which we know from tradition, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox. Nicole Roccas is an Orthodox Christian woman, but this is part of our tradition. We believe that Anna and Joachim are the parents of Mary, and their story is one that begins with infertility and with the real kind of desperation and grief that comes along with that. And the text that Nicole bases this book on is called the Protoevangelium of James. And so I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds on it and have kind of a theological or biblical exegetical discussion. How do you like that, Stacey? Is that a good word? That's great. That's some good theology lingo, right? We don't want to get down into those weeds, but just for people who aren't familiar, to know that the Protoevangelium of James is not a part of the canon of Scripture. So if you go and grab your Bible and open it up, you're not going to find it. And the reason is because the church decided that this particular book did not rise to the level of inspiration that, for example, the Gospels do. So it wasn't included in the official canon of Scripture, and probably in part because I think there are some embellishments within the text. And so for a couple of different reasons, it was decided that it didn't fit into the Bible. However, it really fits into tradition, the tradition of the church. And it was most likely written probably at the end of the 1st century, maybe the beginning to the middle 2nd century. So it's a really old text, and it probably, its foundation is some oral tradition. And it really reflects in a lot of ways the belief of early Christians and the belief of the early church. And it has a lot of really beautiful stories and additions. So we sort of get some additional information about Mary, of course, her parents and her birth, her presentation in the temple. You know, we celebrate that as a feast day. That comes from this Protoevangelium of James. And so I would encourage everybody, if you're listening to this, to also go, you can get the Protoevangelium online. Allie, I think you'll probably link it in the show notes. And so I encourage you to read it. There are some really cool little stories in there. I really like the story of the presentation of Mary in the temple. And I wish we could just do an episode on that one, because I just think there's a lot in there for us to contemplate. So reading that account, which is very short, I think is a nice complement to Under the Laurel Tree, and it puts it into kind of a good context.
I just want to add on the Protoevangelium, she does list some on page 84. She talks about problems with the Protoevangelium, but she does say that like there's content from that which inspires content for Marian feasts that we celebrate. The Conception on December 9th, the Nativity on September 8th, the entrance of the Theotokos on November 21st. So like these are, just because it's not in the canon doesn't mean it's like it ought to be thrown out, if that makes sense. I think sometimes we have this concept of like, well, if it's not in the list of inspired books in the canon, then like, why would we read that? But it can show us, as Anne was saying, like an understanding of what the early church believed. And that's why I think it's important to consider these texts and just like bring to the text the knowledge of, okay, this isn't inspired on the canon, but there's good things that I can take away from it, even though it's not in the list.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, there are some things, some texts that are out there, like the Gospel of Thomas and other texts that we call Gnostic, which when you read them, I mean, really, you don't find those associations that we find with Scripture. Even with some of the embellishments in the Protoevangelium, there's a lot of correspondence with the gospel and with Revelation. In some of those other texts that the church did throw out, it's because there were really, really serious problems. So this probably represents a lot of the tradition, and whether you're Catholic or Orthodox, tradition is really important because it's those common beliefs and practices of the earliest Christians, and they really inform and bring our faith to life.
To kind of jump off of that, as far as her choice specifically to highlight the story of Anne and Joachim, one of the things that she touches on quite a bit is just how much this story is unique and different from many of the other Old Testament. We obviously encounter barrenness quite a bit in the Old Testament, but this is unique in that it's a couple experiencing infertility. And so how much the author, Nicole Roccas, finds comfort in that. So I was just curious to kind of jump off into more of our discussion. Is that something that struck you, or is that something you were already aware of before you read the book? I know, Anne, you have a devotion, obviously, to Anna, your name being Anne. So is that something that, struck you anew in reading this book, or is it, something you were aware of, kind of knowing their story beforehand?
So for me, I mean, yes, Anna is my patron, right? So I knew the story just from hearing it as a kid. And then I've read the Protoevangelium a number of times. But it really, for me, it wasn't until I read that in the book that it really struck me that this really is the story of Anna and Joachim, is a story of a couple wrestling with infertility together. And it seems like Nicole gives some of the other examples, like Sarah and Hannah. And in those cases, we do hear about the husbands, but in some cases, they're a little bit dismissive. Kind of like, okay, won't you get over this already? Or in the case of Sarah and Abraham, right? I mean, Abraham goes with the maidservant, and they decide that that's the way to end up having a child, but that doesn't work out. That creates all sorts of jealousy and is not at all what God intended. But with the story of Anna and Joachim, it really is different. They are experiencing this suffering together, even when they separate. Joachim is really feeling that grief and that inadequacy as a man, I think. And we get a much more, three-dimensional view of this couple in their infertility than we do in some of the other stories in Scripture.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I hadn't considered that it is so unique in that way, but reading, I think Nicole just does such a beautiful job of weaving the reasons behind choosing them in particular throughout the entire book. But I know today we want to get kind of more deeply into just discussing grief as a topic. And I think in this book, one of the reasons I love it and why I also recommend that anyone purchase it who's struggling with infertility, even if you haven't read it, in advance of this book club series, is because it's so affirming, especially in just what it means to be struggling with this grief. I mean, many times throughout the story of Joachim and Anna and in the writing of Nicole, I felt affirmed by the way that she just constantly goes back to, this is a grief, this is really something, even though there's not a tangible loss. And I think it's also important to point out that she specifically mentions that this isn't meant to serve as particularly for a miscarriage grief, that it's unique to infertility. And that's another grief that's often layered with infertility. But here we're talking specifically about infertility. But she just affirms that again and again, that there is something lost here, even though it's not tangible in the way that many other types of grief are. So I really appreciated that. And also that she talks specifically about the loss of dreams, the loss of meaning. And we see this in the life of Anne and Joachim. It's like you see Anne struggling under the laurel tree, crying out to God. And there's a specific line that she mentions, "In what trinkets shall I find solace in life?" And that just struck such a chord with me. It's like, well, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, in what trinkets, where will I find meaning? What will I, do and pursue in my life, in my marriage? So I really appreciated how much Nicole just acknowledged that particular pain.
I find it interesting how, and she lays this out in the introduction, specifically on page 24. She associates how she's going to lay out this structure of the stages of grief that Anna and Joachim go through with those traditional 5 stages from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And if you're not familiar with that, you can look it up. But I think at this point, a lot of people are really familiar with Ross's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And so Nicole takes those and kind of adapts them to the story, and she changes. They sort of follow the same line, but she changes them, those stages, to shame, separation, anger, bargaining, and thanksgiving. And I think it's really interesting how she does that throughout. And I really like that structure. And I've tried in the past, like in talks that I've given, to to discuss the grief of infertility, kind of using that traditional method with those stages. And I could never quite get it to fit, but I love the way that Nicole took those stages and adapted them to this story. And that really resonated with me. I think that this was a really good structure.
I think in chapter 4 is where we sort of launch. It's a chapter on shame, but it's where we begin to sort of see that experience of infertility from a woman's perspective, and then also a man's perspective. And she talks about infertility shame in women, and then infertility shame in men. And I think what struck me about this chapter was the experience of infertility, the experience of grief and shame from a different perspective other than mine, right? To understand maybe more deeply, like, how my husband, like through the lens of Saint Joachim, how my husband might experience his infertility grief. Because we learn in the Protoevangelium that Saint Joachim left for a time and went to the desert, and Saint Anna grieved that as if he were dead. And so, but then they come back together. But I think what's remarkable is like that, the way that they express that pain and shame through the experience of infertility being different. And I think that was really necessary for me to learn and understand in my experience that infertility for me as a woman and how I grieve through it is going to look different than the infertility and shame that my husband experiences, just by virtue of how we're created and how we process it.
Yeah, I completely agree. That chapter was so eye-opening for me. I mean, I knew that, but just hearing it in the way that she discussed it. So, for example, she hits right, I think, the nail on the head when she says, in casual conversations on page 105, I often hear women say that their husbands just don't understand or aren't as upset as they should be about their lack of kids. And I mean, that's so relatable. I mean, I've thought those things myself. I know we've discussed that on different podcast episodes about how that can be something that maybe at an initial glance, it's like, well, he's not crying as much or he's not talking about it as much. But later, Nicole writes that, I can't remember where it is, but she says basically that men don't have that ability to express. I mean, there's a lot at play here, but socially, they don't necessarily, they're not taught to express their emotions in that same way. So we shouldn't expect them to. But then what I also got out of what she wrote is that part of their grief is the grief that we feel. And I know, Anne, you've talked about that before, and just how much it hurts for them to see us, their wives, in pain. And that's no less of a grief than the grief that maybe we feel, in our body, because it's in our body. So that was to read that was just eye-opening, especially like you said, Stacey, in the context of Joachim and his shame. It really, I think I actually read it to my husband and he was like, yeah, yeah. And it was really, I encourage, if this can become a talking point, even if your husband's not reading along with you, maybe like discussing certain sections together, especially when she's writing about from the man's perspective. I think it can lead to some really good conversations and hopefully like helping each other to see, where some of those misunderstandings and those miscommunications can happen when we expect, a certain reaction from the other person. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Stacey, you mentioned that Joachim goes off into the desert, but what precedes that in the Protoevangelium is that, he's going to the temple to make the sacrifice as you normally would. And he's basically kicked out and told, listen, you're kind of not keeping up your end of the covenant, right? You're childless. So, you have no business being here. And just to pick up on what both you and Allie were saying about our husbands, I mean, this is another way I think that shows us the differences in grief. And like you said, Allie, this is something that we as women feel in our bodies, right? Because we're the ones, conception happens in our bodies, and we're the ones who would carry a child. But for the man, I think, at least I tend to maybe not dismiss, but I forget about the fact that, my husband might have these feelings of inadequacy, or like he's letting me down because of this infertility, whether there's a problem with him or with me, medically, whatever it might be. I mean, it's something that we experience together, but individually we can each kind of beat ourselves up and say, what's wrong with me? Or, how is this my fault? And I think men feel that in a different but really acute way, because they are the problem solvers and the initiators, and leave it to me and I'll fix it and I'll find the answer. And when they're not able to do that, for Joachim, he goes off. But maybe our husbands don't, physically leave, but they might shut down. Not that they won't talk to us, but maybe they won't talk to us about this. And it might be sort of like a defense for them because they have no solution.
I found the quote that really hit me on this exact note. It's on page 110. It says, in some sense, it's easier to believe men are emotionally distant or clueless than the alternative, that they feel in the very center of their being that they are a failure, that they are more concerned for their wives' well-being than their own, that they would willingly die or disappear if it meant alleviating our distress. When I read that, I was like, whoa, like it hit me, the depth. As much as I feel this deep emotion, it's like he feels it too. It's just different. And it hit me when in that sentence, it's like, whoa, that's what he feels like. Can you imagine? I can't imagine carrying that, anyway, so it was really helpful kind of get outside of my own head and put myself in his shoes.
Yeah. I think that reminds me so much of the oneness of that we are as spouses to each other. Just that, like, okay, my grief, it's not just mine, it's my husband's too, even if he's not, like expressing it like I am. That doesn't mean it's any less his grief also, because like we're one. So like through this, like our grief is ours together. It's not mine or his. And that's so true. And going back to the uniqueness of the story of Saints Anna and Joachim is that like the seeing the couple going through it together versus just the woman.
Yeah, and later in this chapter, Nicole even says, for the sake of our marriages and our hearts, it's helpful to think in this way. I really appreciated that she wrote that because, I think there's a process we all go through and there's good days and bad days, but I think the more I can challenge myself to, like you said, remember the oneness and the need to see things from the other's perspective. It's like, that's much better than assuming that he just doesn't care, or, if we can challenge ourselves to do that, I think it is good for that oneness and for that unity in our marriage.
Yeah, Allie, in our discussion before, we had been sort of emailing our thoughts before, and you had picked up on that quote on page 28, that this book is not just for women, mainly because women aren't the only side of the gene pool grieving infertility. Men are uniquely sensitive to the shame of a childless marriage. Yet in both church and society, we feminize infertility and its grief in subtle ways. Not only does this harm women, men, and their marriages, it perpetuates a depiction of men as unwilling or emotionally inept father figures. And I think there's a lot packed into that quote, and a lot that we can maybe take to our spouses, kind of in discussion and in reflection with them, and starting conversation, which I know is difficult sometimes. And I know that there are women out there who are listening or who are in our Facebook group, who express specifically that they do have a hard time communicating with their spouses about the infertility. So, I mean, just to also acknowledge that, for some women, I think they feel the isolation of infertility even more acutely, because there is that difficulty in kind of communication.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I remember I was talking with my therapist just like a couple weeks ago, and I was like, I didn't talk to him in like over a year, and I was just filling him in on like our infertility journey. And he asked me like about just like how my relationship with Phil, my husband, like how it's gone through the experience, and sort of like asking if Phil's like opening up kind of thing. And I was and I was like, well, like yes and no. Like he's kind of like, going through it at his own pace, and it looks like totally different than my like feelings and grief emotions. And like a little bit, part of me is like, I understand, but also part of me is like, man, I kind of wish he would open up more or talk to me more. But what my counselor made very clear was like, maybe that's just not true to him and like who he is as a person. And I'm not trying to say that like I share in any ways in that pain of like maybe my spouse is totally on a different page than me, because in so many ways like we're so unified in our grief. So like I'm not trying to like I feel for those people who maybe have a hard time relating to their spouse on any level, because that's not something that I experience. I know we are able to relate to each other. But just the importance of being reminded by somebody else outside, an outside third party, like, maybe your spouse just doesn't experience this the way that you do. I was like, that's really important for me to hear, because sometimes you just are like, why? Why can't you feel this way? Why? Like, we can't tell people how to feel. It's not in my right to be able to do that.
It's an easy thing to fall into, though. I mean, it's, because it's just such and again, the book does such a good job of acknowledging this. Like, it's such an intense feeling and grief, and it can, we all know, like on certain days or certain seasons, like it can just be so deep. And so I think maybe that's where it comes from, like that desire to like share that with someone. But it, I guess marriage helps us grow and pushes us, right, to see that there's not just one way of looking at it. Another thing I wanted to point out about the book is that she includes these little, she did, I think, a series of questions or interviews with, I believe, just people in the Orthodox Church, as far as I know. And so she includes quotes from people who have experienced infertility. And so some are obviously from men, and I found that also.
I think she had done a survey before she was writing the book. She had done a survey.
Okay. So like, for example, on page 52, a man named Aaron says men experience infertility silently, but would like to talk about it with other men. There is a stigma to almost any male mental health issue. We are generally okay for women to have issues, but don't like to talk about our own. So even like hearing this, I think can be helpful for generating that empathy, because I mean, it's definitely been the case in my marriage where I feel like I have many more opportunities to talk about this with other women. I mean, right now is one of them, but It's not as easy, I think, for men to find that, even if it's something that they do desire. So,
yeah, I wrote that one down too, Allie, because I thought that was an important quote. And what I wrote down was that men want to talk, but not the way that we do as women. So, like, that's the other thing, is that we should not expect our husband to, want to go to his friends and, sit down with like wine and, just sort of pour his heart out. I mean, that to me, I guess that's been the most difficult thing, or the most challenging thing in my marriage to learn, is how my husband grieves, how he expresses himself, and to be okay with that. And not try to make him be as, emotional as I am, or, whatever it might be. I mean, I have to allow him, much like your therapist said, Stacey, I have to allow him to just kind of be who he is and to express, the way that he does. And so even as painful as it is, going back to the Protoevangelium, even as painful as it is when Anna and Joachim separate, I mean, I see something positive in that too, because it's like, okay, they sort of see, that they gotta kind of work on themselves, and they're working through, each of them sort of working through, what they're feeling and experiencing emotionally and spiritually, especially. So as much as we do need communication, I think that we as individuals, as wives and husbands, as women and men, we also have to work on ourselves and process through grief and these emotions ourselves, as well. And especially if there is some difficulty in communication, that's even all the more reason to sort of get ourselves together. Not that, we just have to fix ourselves so that we don't feel grief anymore, but to like really, process it through and get our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with God and, better understanding of our spouse before we can kind of as a couple, really move forward.
Another thing I just wanted to point out about the book too is at the end of every chapter there's this discussion and reflection questions, and we might bring some of those up during these episodes, but I think they're also a great thing, again, to discuss with friends or also hopefully with your spouse. Like, for example, in this chapter 4 that we've been discussing, one of the questions is, in what ways do you think your husband's or wife's experience of infertility grief is different from your own? What would help you feel understood by your spouse? I mean, that could be like a great way to just, I mean, I know everyone's a little different and some people might not want to sit down and discuss questions like this, but I mean, I really think that it could be a great thing to visit together if you have the opportunity, and if your spouse is open to it.
Well, and you also don't have to sit down and say, hey, honey, on page 89, this woman has some great questions for discussion. I mean, we can sort of, read them and sit with them and kind of take them in, and then, use that as a way to speak to our husbands, in ways that they understand, in ways that resonate with them, that are kind of more organic, rather than making it seem like, okay, now we're sitting down to a discussion. I think they're good just for sort of getting the wheels turning in our own heads, to then be able to kind of present it in our own words to our husband. Maybe we want to go back to that whole idea of just sort of discussing grief, like what grief is, and the fact that infertility is, I don't know if you want to call it a legitimate kind of grief. I mean, for me, it took a long time. And honestly, it probably was not until I really became involved with Springs in the Desert, and especially when I started hearing the stories of other women, that it sort of hit me that, infertility is something that I am grieving. And especially infertility is something that I was not grieving. And I think that that was very much to my detriment, that, you know, I wasn't thinking that infertility is sort of a legitimate grief, because what did I lose? I mean, I haven't lost anything. No one died. I never conceived and then lost a child. So, so I never thought that I had a right to grieve. And I think Nicole does a really good job of fleshing out grief and talking about how infertility brings along with it, you know, this real sadness, this real kind of period of mourning that we need to acknowledge and enter into and kind of really explore and process for ourselves. And on page 25, we were talking about this quote earlier. She says, infertility is an apophatic grief. By rational standards, we have literally nothing to grieve. But over time, all the gaps and negative spaces of childlessness reveal a shape, a figure, a whisper of a life we long to hold in our arms. And that really resonated with me, because it sort of goes to the mystery that surrounds infertility. There isn't a tangible that I can show you, you know, this is why I am sad. This is why I mourn. It's more mysterious than that. And yet it's real. It's in some way really tangible to me. And so that has been really important for me. And I mean, I would just say to everyone who's listening to us, who is dealing with this cross of infertility, that this is absolutely something that you have a right to grieve, that that you should acknowledge as a real loss in your life and in your marriage. Now, we can flesh out, and that's part of the mission of Springs in the Desert is, okay, then, you know, how do we take that grief and, you know, turn toward fruitfulness and hope and, you know, the life that God wants to give us. But I think we shouldn't be too quick to say, oh, okay, grief and loss. Now let's move on and let's find the answer, or let's find the end of it. I think it's important for us, like Anna does in the Protoevangelium, to kind of sit with it and work through it.
I heard something yesterday that said, you don't move on, you move forward. And when it comes to grief, and I think that's just as much true with infertility. Like, I have a close friend who was on the road with me for like 4 years or so, and she recently had a miraculous pregnancy. And, you know, I can see that it's still, and she said to this, like, this has changed who I am. Like, this experience of infertility has changed the way I see things, and, you know, my marriage and how I look at the world. And I thought that was very profound, that, you know, it doesn't just like end when we get pregnant or when we, you know, go through menopause or whatever it is. Like, it's a part of our experience, but that doesn't mean that we can't move forward with our lives.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think this book does a good job of like acknowledging the grief, but also like walking forward through, you know, these phases to help us understand like how to move forward with our spouse, how to have, you know, how to reach out to, like Joachim does with Abraham, looking to these people that can inspire us, like Elizabeth Lasser and St. Anne, who can help us walk forward and find, you know, like Anne said, the fruitfulness that God's calling us to. So
I want to also add just the importance of grieving. Like, there has infertility, like the experience of infertility, you won't find healing without going through the grief. So it's not like you can just like remove it from your experience. It's gonna be there, whether you want it to be there or not. But I was recently speaking with a woman in her experience, sort of, she knew that they were going to struggle going into marriage. They married a little bit older, not that old, but like in her 30s, which I got married when I was 23. So like to her, that was older. But she and her husband went right away to adoption, which is like been a beautiful blessing for them. But like, she's realizing that now, like, she still is experiencing grief and hasn't processed it all. Now that she's had adopted a number of children, and she never realized like that grief would be a part of her experience, because they were like, you know, everyone says, oh, just adopt, you know, and sometimes you can buy into that concept of just adopt and like all the pain will go away and it'll be fine once you have a baby in your arms. It's not that simple. There still has to be a processing of the grief of infertility. And adoption is a whole separate category of discernment. And I know I've said this before to many people, but just that concept of like the grief is going to be there, whether you ignore it or whether you put in the work to process it. And so I can say from my experience and from this woman that shared her story with me, like, the better path is to process it and learn how to learn what grief, what plan the Lord has to your grief, and to allow it to turn you in the direction of fruitfulness and bearing fruit in your life. But running away from it isn't going to bring healing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Stacey. And that, as you were speaking, that made me think of, and I don't know, maybe this is a good place to kind of bring our discussion to an end and look ahead to some of the other episodes that we're going to do of the discussion. But on page 46, Nicole talks about this word sterility, which I hate that word. Like, it's just such a cold, and I don't know, to me, it's just a term that lacks hope. So she talks about that, and she says, I avoid the term sterility except in direct quotation. She says, I don't regard any human being as truly incapable of bearing or producing life, even people who have been medically diagnosed as such. The witness of Christ, and this is the really important part, I think, for us, and is that kind of light at the end of the grief, or even mixed in with the grief. The witness of Christ demonstrates that biological procreation is merely a shadow or icon of the life he has given us. Our task, whether barren or sterile or fertile, is to manifest that life to the world through whatever means, opportunities, bodies, and talents he has given us. And that, I think, is the quote that gives me such hope in the midst of my own grief as I continue to process through that regardless of the fact that at this point in my life, at 53 years old, and my husband at 55, and my cycles have stopped now. So, barring a true divine intervention, conception is not going to happen for us. And yet my marriage is not, or does not have to be sterile. It is life-giving, and every marriage is. And whether or not a particular act, a marital act, a particular moment where we come together in that intimate way, whether or not that bears physical fruit, it always bears fruit, or it should always bear fruit in our marriages, drawing us closer together. But then also through that, like, that bond should animate us and animate our lives in the world, and how we communicate with others, how we care for others, whether it's in our family or in the community or in our parish. So none of us is sterile. None of us is empty and lifeless. We all are reflecting the life, the source of all life. We are reflecting Christ, and we're reflecting God's love in the world, and we're bearers of that love. And even in the midst of our grief, we are able to give life. And so I guess you're right. The idea is maybe not to get over or move past, but to move forward, even if we still carry some remnant of that grief, to realize that it's a means for fruitfulness. It's a means for giving life. I've said this before, and this may sound like really awful and cold, but it's the truth. Had we gotten pregnant, none of this would have meant anything to me. I mean, I might have looked at someone who can't have children and think, oh, isn't that too bad? And I might have kind of looked on them with pity and thought, oh, that's really sad, right? But I wouldn't have really cared that much. I think I wouldn't have been so invested. And so for me, it's odd to say, but the gift of infertility has really been, I think, in some ways, to have a better understanding of some of the things that other people are carrying, the burdens that they carry, and see how life-giving they are to me through those burdens. And when I can reach out to another person and care for them, that's a real way that I can be mothering, and that I can love, and that I can step outside of myself. I'm really good at being self-centered. But my infertility has just opened up so many opportunities for me to learn how to step outside of myself. So I don't know if that makes sense. You guys are really good. You are good and holy women. So
no,
my experience probably doesn't.
I totally relate, Anne.
Definitely.
That feeling, that sense of like, if I hadn't been through this, I would have had no empathy for other people who experience this, because how would it have related to me and my experience and my pain? And so I suppose it helps also give me more patience with other people that don't show empathy towards me, and to realize that, like, okay, I'm not too far off from that, because I wouldn't have been any better.
I'm such an idealist that I would have been like, oh, I have my perfect little family and everything's beautiful and wonderful. And I think I just would have been so caught up in that. I mean, I'm sure, God's always reaching out to everyone, and nobody's life is perfect. I think that's another thing that infertility has taught me, is like, even if it looks perfect on Facebook, probably it's not. So, there's always more that people are struggling with, because we're not in heaven yet. Like, it's, we're here and we're challenged and lots of things happen. But I think that, I love that quote. I think it's so awesome. I think it really speaks to that idea that, like, even someone who is blessed with biological children, if they don't spiritually care for those children, like, they're not really fulfilling their duty as bearers of, Christ's life in the world. And in the same way, people who don't have biological children can really do that, even without, that particular blessing. So I just think that it really broadens our perspective to hear that and have that affirmed, that, no one is truly sterile.
It also reminds me that, we may not realize it, but honestly, those of us who don't have children, who have not been able to conceive or to bring a child to term, we are witnesses for the marriages of those people who do have children, who do have, big families or small or medium-sized families, because it can be really easy to get so wrapped up in your own family and what they're doing that you don't look outside of it, and you're not participating in the community, or you're not attending to friends in the way that you ought to. Of course, it's different when you have those those family obligations, but I think there is also a danger that you become so isolated and insular within your family that you sort of forget about your obligation to bring the love that's generated in your family out into the world and make it fruitful in the world. So I think we actually, sometimes we sort of think that, well, we're childless, there's a kind of uselessness to that. What do we have to offer? But I think that, what we have to offer is that witness to the importance of bringing the love and the life that's within the family structure or within the couple relationship out into the world. And I think that's sort of what Nicole is, one of the things that she gets at in this book as well. So, if you're out there and you're listening and, you're in the midst of that grief, please know that you and your marriage are an important and a vital and necessary witness of Christ's love and his presence in the world.
Yeah, if you struggle with any sort of thoughts, or just like, even if they're passing, but things that come to mind that make you feel as though like your marriage doesn't matter, like those are from Satan. So like those need to be like dispelled and renounced, because like there's goodness and there is beauty in your marriage, regardless of if you bore biological children, regardless of if you have yet figured out what the fruits of your marriage are. They're there, I'm sure, and they're very unique. And don't be afraid to sort of like explore and ask God to open your eyes to see the ways that your marriage is bearing fruit. I talk a lot about my work with high school ministry, but like that's like one avenue of the way that my marriage is bearing fruit. And so I just want to like speak truth to the fact that your marriage is bearing fruit, regardless of what you might think or the lies that are being, planted in your head. But then also spend time trying to like understand and discern more deeply what ways your marriage is bearing fruit specifically, because I'm certain there are ways, and the Lord, wants to make those, reveal them to you so you can sort of lean into what he's calling you to do with your marriage. And it is going to be super unique. Don't expect it to look like anything specific.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.
All right. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Women at the Well Virtual Book Club. We've loved sharing this discussion, and we want to hear from you. So please comment on our Facebook group. You'll see some questions posted there. Chime in, tell us what favorite quotes you have, what you really love about the book. And join us again for our second episode, which will air on November 11th. And in the meantime, please also subscribe and like our podcast and rate it. If you look on Apple, I think it's Apple Podcasts, you can rate the podcast. That will help us reach more people. And if you're not already following us on Facebook and Instagram, definitely do so, because we have other awesome things happening as well. And you can get some inspiration and encouragement through our social media channels. So with that, it's been great being with you, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.